Virtual ceremony for 2020. I would like to introduce Darren Shearlock, a Master Sergeant U.S. Army retired who serves as our Veterans Resource Officer. Darren.
Hello, Riverhawks. It's good to be with you today. And I'd like to start off by saying that today on 9/11, which is Patriots Day, we're gathered today to share the memories, honor the service and sacrifice of everybody that remembers and had some connection with the events on 9/11. And we figured that the best way to do that this year in a COVID environment is to get together some fellow Riverhawks so we can share our perspectives on where we were, what happened, how it affected our lives, and if it's changed our point of view. That being said, I'd like to introduce Rob Anderson, who's one of our professors here at WVUP, to start off with a historical perspective on what happened on September 11th, 2001.
Thank you, Darren. When I was asked to participate on this panel, I gave some thought to how I wanted to approach this. And my goal was to put this into a bit of broader historical perspective before we get to the actual events of 9/11. And when we look at 9/11, many people think events occur in a vacuum. But in reality, the events of 9/11 began during the Cold War. It all began with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan a few days before Christmas, 1979. Their goal was to prop up a failing leftist government, and what resulted was a decade-long war in which they could not suppress the insurgents. It was, in essence, the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The insurgents were actually supported by the United States. The insurgents, the rebels, many of them were not from Afghanistan. They were true believing Muslims who believed it was their responsibility to fight the invaders of an Islamic nation. And these rebels were called Mujahideen, and they were motivated by Islam, and they wanted to drive out the invaders. And for a decade, the United States sponsored them within the context of the Cold War. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviets withdrew, and in essence, it created a political vacuum. And in short, the radicalized Muslims were able to gain power. They were known as the Taliban. And they created a Muslim emirate, and they were very much supportive of exporting radicalized Islam. And they would harbor radical groups and individuals, and the most notorious would be Osama bin Laden. And he was a very wealthy son of a Saudi billionaire who would sponsor terrorism. And their goal was to target the threats to the Muslim world. And obviously, to bin Laden, the United States was the target. And to fast forward to September 11th, 2001, the United States was the target. He wanted a huge strike against the United States to hit symbolic structures of America's economic power, political power, and military power. And he also wanted to show the United States that they were not immune to terrorism, because Americans had for centuries believed that they were safe, that the oceans and friendly neighbors kept us safe from this type of terrorism. And so the targets on September 11th, 2001 were the World Trade Center towers, the Pentagon, and the Capitol. And now, as we go through the events of September 11th, a group of 19 terrorists seized 4 planes that were scheduled for cross-country flights. American Airlines Flight 11 was flying from Boston to LA. United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston to LA as well. American Airlines from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, and United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco. The Flight 11, American Flight 11, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. And all people aboard and hundreds of people in the building were killed immediately. And as we have seen over and over again, the crash created a fire unlike most people had ever seen before. It was a very hot fire. The jet fuel, these planes were full of jet fuel. I just watched another documentary last night, and one of the planes had over 24,000 gallons of jet fuel. United 175 crashed into South Tower 17 minutes later at 9:03 a.m., killing everyone aboard and again creating another enormous fire. Then 34 minutes later, American Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, killing everyone on board and 125 people on the ground, again creating another fire. By this point, word was starting to spread, and passengers on Flight 93, United 93, recognized that this was not what they would have said at the time, a typical hijacking where the plane would have been taken to an airport to meet the hijackers' demands. They knew that based on the 3 other flights, that they were probably going to be another, flying missile to destroy an American site. And so the passengers attempted to retake the plane. The hijacker who was in control of the plane refused to yield, and they crashed in a field just outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, in Somerset County. That was at 10:07 a.m. A few minutes before that, the unthinkable had happened. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed 56 minutes after impact. Then 29 minutes later, 102 minutes after impact, the North Tower collapsed. All told, the loss of life that day was unimaginable. The official number today is 2,997 dead. The World Trade Center lost over 2,700, the Pentagon 189, and the crash at Shanksville 44. That included passengers, crew, and terrorists. Now, as we're going to talk today, this obviously changed America forever and would ignite the war on terror, which has lasted now for well over 18 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. We would now like to talk to some of our panelists and ask them some specific questions. We will start with our campus police officer, Al Collins. Where were you and what were you doing on 9/11?
I'd actually gone to my supervisor at the time's office to talk to him. It's up where the Student Services Center is now. It was a little small office, and he had a 12-inch TV inside there, and he always kept it on one of two channels. He either had the Weather Channel on if we were expecting any kind of inclement weather, or he had CNN on so that he had a roll of news all the time. So if anything national was happening that might affect us, he would know about it. So he kept the news on all the time, volume low, just sitting off in a corner. And him and I sat there, we were talking, and he could see the TV, but my back was sort of to it. And he got a surprised look on his face, and he's like, CNN's got something going on, and turn that up. And I turned around, turned it up for him, and they had just come on talking about the crash. And at the time, they believed it was an accident when they first came on. CNN came up, I think it was, I just watched everything again the other day, just preparing for this and stuff. And the exact CNN thing is on YouTube. The whole 2-3 hours, you can sit and watch the whole thing. And it was 8:49. So it was like 3 minutes after the crash had happened, and they were calling it an accident at the time. And the reporter stood there talking about this plane accidentally flying into it. And him and I were watching it. My boss and I were watching it. And then a few minutes later, you saw the second plane go by and hit the second tower, hit the south tower. But the reporter had his back to it. And so when the explosion happened, he's like, oh, there's an explosion. Something must have caught fire in the building or something. And they didn't know that it was actually part of the accident until like 10 minutes later. They had another reporter that was down on the ground somewhere doing a financial report, and he cut in and said, that was a second plane. There's two planes now. And at that point, they started to realize that this might not be accidents.
All right, thank you. Mr. Shearlock, would you like to share where you were at that point in time?
Yeah, so on that year I was in the Army at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I was in the Army for about 6 years at that point. And that particular day, I was getting ready to be transferred from Fort Bragg to Atlantic City, New Jersey, to start recruiting duty. So all that morning and the last few days, I was loading the truck up with all my household goods and furniture and whatnot to move. But I still had one last piece of paper that I had to turn in on Fort Bragg before I could leave. Well, like I said, I was moving there, and I was not in uniform, had some sweaty, dirty clothes on, and hadn't shaved for a little bit as I was loading everything up. And on the way driving into Fort Bragg, heard on the radio that there was the first plane and hit, and everybody was thinking it was an accident. And I stopped to get a piece of paper from the rental agency that I was getting the truck from for the insurance. And as I was sitting in there filling out that insurance paperwork, he had a TV in the background, and we saw the second tower get hit. And when I saw that, I said to myself, this isn't an accident. We're actually at war. So I got in the truck with all my gear and decided to drive on to Fort Bragg right then and get that last piece of paper signed. And as I'm doing that, I go through the front gate. And at this time, it's been probably about 10 minutes since the second tower was hit. And all of Fort Bragg was abuzz. In fact, at that gate, they had machine gun pits with sandbags built up to protect them. And they had what looked like 18, 19-year-old soldiers manning them, who looked extremely nervous and were looking at everybody and everywhere as if the next attack was going to happen right there at that Fort Bragg gate. As I go through, they stop, ask what I'm doing. I show them my military ID, except I'm not in uniform and I haven't shaved in a few days, so it didn't look like the picture. So I had to get out of the truck, find my leave paperwork, explain to the soldier, no, I'm a staff sergeant. I'm on leave. That's why I haven't shaved. You can look through my truck to see that it's furniture and household goods. He calmed down a little bit, let me went through, and once I pulled my truck to the side, and I talked to those two soldiers at the machine gun pits. And I asked them how old they were. One said he was 18. The other said he was 20. And just looking at their face, you could see that they were terrified because they now have a machine gun with live ammunition and are looking at every American that's coming through there. They might be the next enemy. So, I talked to them for a couple minutes, told them to remember their training, listen to their sergeant, and then I drove away to get that last piece of paperwork. And when I did, I went into my boss's office and said, it was a sergeant major. I said, Sergeant Major, we're at war. And in his office, everybody had every news channel you could think of on a screen of different TVs. And he told me, we're not at war. Nobody's sure what happened. I said, no, I think we're at war right now. So I'd like you to cancel my recruiting orders to keep me here at this unit. And I'll never forget what he said. He looked at me and says, Sergeant Shearlock, if you're right and we're really at war with somebody that can do this, then we need people to recruit more military because this is going to be a huge fight. I left his office and drove up to Atlantic City for recruiting duty.
Well, thank you for sharing that story, Master Sergeant Shearlock. That was quite touching and very heartfelt. Kim Mcphee is an advisor in our professional advising center on the campus. Kim, where were you at that day?
I was actually on campus in my office, which was where HR is now. It was the Dean of Academic Affairs office. And right after the first plane hit, my boss at the time, Joe Badgley, his wife called and said, a plane just hit the tower in New York. And I'm like, you're kidding me, right? And she's like, no. And then Joe wasn't in his office, so I had him call her right back. And she, if I remember correctly, it's been a while, she was a reporter of some kind for the newspaper. And so she was in her office at that time as well, and was keeping us up to date of what was going on, because we didn't have all the TVs around campus then like we do now. And it was Al's supervisor, Dave Cunningham. Al, correct me if I'm wrong, but he wheeled out the big TV so we could all go up front in front of the president's office. There was one TV and we were all gathered around it to see what was going on.
Yep.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson, were you on campus that day or were you somewhere else?
I was actually at home that day. I was adjuncting at Penn State Altoona, and I was just working at home. It was just a normal day like it was for everybody else. And my wife called. She was away on business, and she said that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center. And my first reaction was probably like many, that it was probably a small plane that the pilot made in air and crashed, because I had read something like that had happened years before in another building in New York City. And so, but my wife said, no, it's a little worse than that. So I turned on the TV, and CNN was on, and it watched everything unfold before me, like it did for most of America. And so it was obviously disbelief at first. Then when I actually finally got to campus, there was this surreal feeling that life was changing, that we were never going to be the same. And then a few days later, just after the planes were allowed to start flying again, I was giving a presentation near Pittsburgh, and we were driving by the airport, and I saw a jet flying overhead, and it was just, as I recall, it's just the strangest feeling, seeing a plane in the air after what had just happened. And something that I had seen countless times before now struck me as being different, and it was. And so, we tried to plot along and understand what had happened and how it had happened. So it was, again, I was actually, just as one last thought here, I was actually just about an hour or so away, living at the time, from the Shanksville site. And so, it was not necessarily local for me, but it was more local than you would expect when it comes to world news.
Thank you. So what were your first thoughts when you heard about the terrorist attacks, Officer Collins?
When we first figured out that it was a terrorist attack, I was pretty angry. I mean, when we first saw it, I was kind of sad that Americans had died. And Dave and I were even hopeful that because of how the plane went into the building and didn't like have a hard landing into a ground or something, that maybe somebody had survived. We said anybody they hit didn't, we knew that. But we were kind of hopeful that maybe people in the plane did. But when it came out that it was against America, that they were actually attacking us and it wasn't just an accident, we got very angry. I mean, like the professor said earlier, we've always felt safe. We've got an ocean on both sides of us and friendly neighbors above and below us. And so we've always felt safe here. And the only time we'd ever been really attacked like this was Pearl Harbor. And that was away from us and closer to where somebody else was. So it just seemed impossible that somebody could come here and do that with us being the best military force in the world, that they'd come here and attack us.
Master Sergeant Shearlock, you had already shared that you were one of the first to think that we were at war. So what were your first thoughts when you heard it was terrorism?
Well, my first thought was this it was confusion, really, and how I was saying to myself, as a military, how do we protect America? And traditionally, before this, the main thing that we had with every piece of our technology was always the threat of death. It was always, if the bad guys come, we'll either kill them or threaten to kill them, and that'll make them stop. But people that would fly a plane into a building and intentionally kill themselves, the threat of death doesn't work anymore. So I was wondering how could we use that to protect us when people are willing to kill themselves just to hurt us.
Okay, Ms. Mcphee, what was your first thought when you heard it was terrorism?
I was actually worried for all of us. I was scared. I didn't want to believe it was terrorism. My husband at the time worked for the federal government, and I selfishly thought of us and how it would affect us. I had people who I went to school with that worked at the Pentagon. So when that plane hit, I worried about their safety. It was just a very scary day.
Dr. Anderson, can you share what your first thoughts were when you heard it was terrorism?
Like many Americans, obviously, mixed emotions, anger, fear, sorrow. Also recognizing that, particularly after, President Bush's words about, fighting terror wherever it was harbored, this was going to be a very long conflict, and that it's such a type of conflict that we don't know when there is victory or defeat. It's not a perfect analogy, but I look at, I compare, the war on terror to the Cold War. It's always present. How do you know when you win? How do you know when you lose? And so it was just that feeling of uncertainty, and really life was out of control. That we, even with our, spectacular military and our defenses, no matter what we do, people are never going to be entirely safe.
Okay, thank you. Master Sergeant Shearlock, I'm going to start with you on the next question. How did the events of that day change your worldview?
So the first thing that it changed my worldview is I started studying a lot more about the Middle East, Islam, and the political relations between the United States and the countries in that region. And well, from a practical matter, I ended up going to the Middle East several times. But the way it changed my worldview is I started to look at the connections that happened previously. Something that Dr. Anderson mentioned about how this doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I started to one, feel a little bit depressed that not only myself, but a lot of the people that get paid to do large national security didn't see this, couldn't have predicted this or see this happen, because we should have. There was a lot of historical precedent that would have led us to believe that something like this was possible. So it made me look a lot more into historical things and the relationship between Western culture and Islamic culture.
Officer Collins, do you have something to add to the change it had on your worldview?
Well, I actually, after the first few days, I tried to see, was there something good to come out of this? And I noticed that the people, if you remember George Bush's time, there was bickering between the Democrats and the Republicans, and everybody was divided and everything, but everybody came together at this time. We came together as Americans and said, we're not going to let this happen. You're not going to come on our ground and fight us, and we'll do whatever we have to do to stop it. And so I seen everybody coming together. Now, here's where I have to disagree with the professor, is he said it changes forever. It changes for about 8 years, and we've gone back to being just like we were. We don't realize that we need to rely on each other if we're going to stop things like this from outside, people from outside of us tearing us up. They've said for years, nobody wants to fight America face to face, stand toe to toe with us and fight us and in a battle. But they hope that they can get us angry at each other and get us to battle within ourselves and tear ourselves apart. That's the only hope they have. And so I had a hopefulness for a while, and I enjoyed that, how close we became and how we all were united. But I see that just falling apart, and I think that's something we got to get back. We got to get back to where everybody matters. We take care of everybody, and everybody is on the same team. We're proud of America again.
All right, thank you. Dr. Anderson, do you have anything to add?
The United States, the leadership, I think, and when I say leadership, not just political, but also military and the CIA and so forth, I think we're still bogged down with a Cold War mentality. We hadn't made any transition yet to looking at the potential of terror. In the United States also, I think, believes that if given a chance, everybody wants to be like us. And, I think it's been proven too often that not everybody wants to be like the United States. Obviously, again, you look at Afghanistan, there are too many factions, there are too many groups, the tribalism. I think we failed to really to understand. And again, Master Sergeant Shearlock, I think, really made the good point, is that our failure to communicate between the international and national agencies, the inability in large part because of laws to protect us from, spying, to protect, us meaning the American citizens, from spying by, like, the CIA. We have constitutional rules, and, we are a free people, and we don't want to live in a nation where we're being controlled for our own safety. Look at COVID-19. We don't want to be hunkered down, as I saw Dr. Fossey say today. There's a real potential for this winter. We don't like that. We're a free people, and so unfortunately, Al, you mentioned about America was able to cooperate. That was a fantastic. We don't feel as safe as we once did.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mcphee, would you be able to tell us how the events of that day changed your life?
Yeah, I'm happy to share with you the fact that, like I said before, my husband at the time was a federal agent, and he decided, even though that we had 3 young children at home, age 11, 9, and 6, that he needed to do something he just needed to do something. So he became an air marshal, and he was gone for 6 months at that time, I think. And just knowing what he was doing and knowing what had happened, I lived in fear for those 6 months. Mother of 3 young children, is he going to come home? Is there going to be another attack? And it was, I don't even know how to explain it. It's not something even to this day that I care to relive.
Understandably, thank you. Master Sergeant Shearlock, would you like to tell how that changed your life?
Yeah, so before the attacks, my job in the military focused a lot on South America and the Caribbean, trying to see how the military can reduce the illegal drug flow to the United States. Once 9/11 happened, like I said, I went on recruiting duty, which was supposed to be for 3 years, but they pulled me back within a year to be in a more active fighting style unit. But instead of focusing on South America, now we're focusing on the Middle East. So a year after 9/11, I was in Iraq, and there was a lot of terrorist attacks on us over there. Then I was in Jordan, trying to train the Jordanian people on how they could improve their military to prevent terrorist attacks in Jordan, and do the same thing the next year for the people in Kuwait. And then a couple years later in West Africa, trying to tamp down Islamic extremism in Burkina Faso and Mauritania. And you just noticed that it seemed like it was, I don't know if it was spreading more or if we were just noticing it more. But I remember talking to my command back in the United States when I was in Burkina Faso and saying, hey, I think that Al-Qaeda is gaining a foothold here. And they told me, no, it's not that bad there. And I ended up walking by a park bench and saw Al-Qaeda scribed into the bench, and walked a little bit further and seen some more pro-Al-Qaeda signs and graffiti in the store shop. And I had to report back to the command that this is not just coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan. This is spreading into West Africa pretty strong, because storefront windows are actually just purposefully displaying pro-Al-Qaeda signs, and wasn't just graffiti that someone put up in the middle of the night. So for me personally, it was a lot of deployments overseas, a lot of times where I have to tell my wife and children, I've got to go. I'm going to be gone for 6 months, maybe a year, and I can't really tell you where I'm going right now. But it's, I'm going to Africa, I'm going to the Middle East, and I'll be thinking about you and right when I can.
I'm sure that's a difficult time. Officer Collins, you were with us in Parkersburg throughout that time frame. So how did it change your life?
Well, I'll tell you one other thing that we had going on. The public debt down here. It was mentioned by one of the staffers here earlier before we came on air that they had a parent that worked there, and they were concerned that they might attack there. And that was a concern that we had in the area was, will they try to mess with the big plants that are in our area? Will they try to mess with the federal building that's in our area? Because in my law enforcement training, we've trained hundreds of times saying that the chemical plants that are up and down the Ohio River, starting in Wheeling and going all the way to Charleston, could be devastating to a large population if somebody could attack those. And so I've been through a number of trainings where we've had to deal with what do we do? And we've even here at the campus, we do trainings on what happens if something happens down at formerly DuPont. Can't think of what it is now, but they say if something happens there, what do we do? And how do we react to it? And I work with the sheriff's department, the health department, all these different departments, figuring out what'll be everybody's role and how will we all work together to prevent something like this? Because I mean, one of the things we do in law enforcement is they say all the time, I see reports, especially since 9/11, because now the FBI used to, individual law enforcement agencies kept their stuff to themselves. Since 9/11, we've started to share better and talk to each other and say, here's things you need to be watching for. I hear all the time that incidents have happened around us where somebody's tried to do something. And one of the things that as law enforcement, we say all the time is, we have to prevent every single one of them. We have to be right 100% of the time. People trying these things only have to be right once, as in 9/11, and they devastate us. I mean, they hurt all of America on that day.
We are thankful that you are well trained and that many others are as well. Also joining us today is our college president, Dr. Chris Gilmer, who would like to share a few words.
First, I'd just like to thank our Veteran Resource Center for keeping this at the forefront of our mind. It's so important that we don't ever forget. And I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for sharing things that I'm sure were difficult for some of you to share today. I was a faculty member at Tougaloo College in Mississippi when this happened, and I didn't have classes that morning, so I was at home. And I remember that my first thought was for my students. I wouldn't be able to be a classic first responder in the truest sense, but what it occurred to me that I could do to help was to go to my students as quickly as I could so that maybe I would be able to be some source of comfort to them, because I remember how devastated the young population was at this time. And while this brought to my mind the idea of man's inhumanity to man, which we've heard about so often, and the horrific scenes depict that day also reinforced to me man and woman's humanity to man and woman as well, because a visual that will be with me until my last days, and I'm sure some of you saw it as well, is a visual of daycare workers, and brought tears to my eyes then, and it may today. Daycare workers loading little children into shopping carts in the area that was around central Manhattan, and trying to push those little children children to safety, away from what happened. And, I feel a chill come over me as I say that, because they weren't thinking of themselves. They were thinking of somebody else's children that day, of America's children, and trying to save them. And that is the image that I will always remember. And I'm very proud to be a part of an institution that after all these years is committed to remembering and committed to paying honor to those who made sacrifice that day.
All right, thank you all for attending. This will end today's presentation, and we appreciate you being with us.